So over the last 6 months, we, the Artists Working Group, had already started doing our own research into what goes into creating a new arts ecosystem for Chinese and East and Southeast Asian British artists. Through roundtables and extending our circle to include many more people and voices than our initial 7 campaigners, we were aware that it's all very well saying that's wrong with CFCCA or the sector or the Manchester art scene. But as creatives, we're also interested in what's right and how we can go about creating what's right. I say what's right here advisedly, and I really use this as a rhetorical device, really, because what I think I really mean is what works. And it is odd that at this midway point of my talk, I should now declare to you that I don't have any idea, that I don't have the answers about what could work, because we're just beginning to explore this. I should really stop this talk now because I really have nothing to report to you. So instead, for the last half of this talk, let me invite you into a speculation, into our speculation of what approaches and what experiments that might be needed towards creating the context and ecosystem that could enable an East and Southeast Asian artists and creatives to thrive. While I'm specifically holding East and Southeast Asian experience in my mind, I'm hoping that some of this and some of what I say is translatable and will find resonance to other groups who are working with and alongside in the sector. A caveat though, you will have noticed that I started by saying Chinese artists, and then I used the phrase East and Southeast Asian artists. Well, briefly, East and Southeast Asian is a phrase that is in growing usage over the last few years in Britain. It is an arbitrary term because East Asia as a geographic region isn't a unified political bloc. Southeast Asia can be expressed as a political bloc when it is organized under the banner of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. ASEAN certainly doesn't see itself in unity with East Asia, and some of its members, in fact, are in opposition to China and Japan, both territorially and historically. In my opinion, East and Southeast Asian finds meaning in Britain because of the shared racism people from East and Southeast Asia experience living here. A similar grouping exists in the USA, and they call themselves AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander. I've outlined a few features of the shared racism already in my points about CFCCA's Orientalism, model minority, and how we are viewed as dispensable and scabbable. And also, but I would just want to add that we also share the fact that COVID racism indiscriminately targets anyone who is mistaken for being Chinese or near Chinese. And that includes East and Southeast Asian people. In particular, there is one more aspect of shall we say, Oriental racism, which is its long history of associating Chinese or East and Southeast Asian bodies with disease, multitudinousness, and therefore cheapness, and usability, particularly our bodies being fetishized as sites of sexual or technological fantasy. So for the purposes of defining an East and Southeast Asian culture in the UK, I consider that we have to navigate the fact that there is no such thing as East and Southeast Asian in Asia, and that our particular experience of exclusion, inequality, and racism in the UK is what binds this very diverse group. So that being said, I find myself back in the space of critiquing again. I know we just like always go back to critique rather than being positive. And I want to move towards imagining what could work. Here, I want to speculate on 4 methodologies that inform how I'm thinking through possible new arts ecologies. The first is to develop for myself the idea of critical Asianness. Artist colleagues that I have consulted with so far really actually quite dislike the idea of pairing the word critical with the word Asianness. I think generally artists I've spoken to are hesitant about the modalities of critique and the sense of antagonism and harm in it. But for me, critical thinking and doing isn't about deconstructing per se, but to deconstruct in order to create. I am speculating, for example, that if in an Asian cosmology, say, that there is no soul. I mean, that's pretty common. There is no soul, which is what Buddhist philosophy believes, or that there is no such thing as an individualist soul, individualist in the Thatcherite sense. So if there, and even if there is a soul, you could say, for example, the Sikhs believe in the idea of Atma, which is the individual spark of the individual soul in us. Well, this individual spark is no different from the universal spark. And then when we die, our spark joins the universal spark. So the spark inside and the spark in the universe are the same. So what's all this got to do with art ecologies and organizations? Well, we need, if this is true, then we need to shed the idea that an organization has a soul or an essence, or that its progress, or that it progresses as an individuated and competitive entity, or that it has an enduring brand. If indeed an Asian worldview is premised on the impermanence of ego, and that we are not just in this together, but that our energies are connected and combined to make world, then a critical Asian approach of doing organization would let go of competition, evaluative frameworks of linear and teleological growth. That's critical Asianness. Second methodology. Secondly, this worlding and this creation of a new ecosystem cannot happen along old Newtonian and Cartesian lines. By this, I mean that we cannot imagine a new context using methodologies of the old context. Invariably, this will lead to creating old contexts that parade as new, but in reality, they are the same old thing. Here, I would love to foreground the work of new materialist writers like the quantum physicist, Karen Barad, who proposes that the physical world at quantum level is actually made up of dynamic intra-actions of agents that create difference. And it is these differences that manifest as matter. This is a complicated idea, but the key takeaway for me is that what happens as reality is always contingent on the dynamic intra-actions of different actors, be they human or non-human. In this sense, there is no singular individuated author, even if there appears to be an author. In fact, the manifestation of authorship itself is a co-created interaction of different actors that includes the author themselves and many other human and non-human entities. So any arts ecology has to be understood as a manifestation of intra-acting differences rather than the grand plan of one or a few people, or DCMS, I might add. Connected to this, the third methodology, connected to this is what the more than human world can offer us when thinking about organizing systems. I don't have enough time to explore in detail here, but the work of writers like Anna Singh points us to non-human cosmologies, as it were, of symbiosis, of mycelial knowledge sharing, and indeed what I would consider mycelial empathy, between, say, trees and fungus. How can we begin to think of artist networks, professional networks, and even arts prize giving as forms of more than human knowledge making and connecting? And my fourth methodology, which informs my work, finally, because I'm talking about all of this in terms of a future imagination and a futurity, I consider that we need to queer and decolonize the act of future imagining itself, because so much of how we imagine a future has been folded in with hidden colonial, patriarchal, heteronormative, and neoliberal optics. As to borrow from Sarah Ahmed's writing in her book, The Promise of Happiness, we are not necessarily asking for a utopia of happiness for East and Southeast Asian artists, because happiness itself, or conceptions of the good life, is already entangled in colonial and capitalist vision. Ahmed instead proposes that maybe all we're asking for is a space to breathe, a space for queer breath. It sounds simple, but in reality, there are places in the world, including some subspaces, even in Britain, where queer people and Black people don't have a right to freely breathe, or even have a meaningful right to their life mattering.